So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Hailey.
Thank you very much. So we plan to talk for about the next 20 minutes or so, and this is what we are going to be covering today. I'm going to start with a librarian perspective, so I'll be talking about how fake news fits into the information landscape that we're seeing today, and what that means for what students need from librarians in terms of the information literacy instruction that we deliver. And then Tom is going to follow with his perspective from the field of journalism. He'll talk about some strategies for identifying accurate information, as well as more about the current moment and what some challenges are that journalists are facing. So before I delve into that meat of the presentation, I do want to spend just a little bit of time defining some of the terms because fake news is used in many different ways. I think that the real definition for fake news is disinformation. So things that are deliberately false, and they may also be spread in a systematic manner, which would make them propaganda as well. So misinformation would be something that's unintentional, unintentionally false. And then we're also seeing fake news used as a derogatory term for purposes of annihilation or for discrediting, as how President Trump uses it to talk about the mainstream media. So the epidemic part is the idea that it spreads virally online, and it spreads through social media with real people, but also with bots as well. And that there are news sources that may be complicit in its spreading, but then are also the ones who are the fake news sources who might be creating this, are sources that are driven by a profit motive, or they might just be negative actors. And those are the people creating the fake sites. And then there are also powerful actors who are helping to spread fake news when it meets their own ends. So what about the current moment then is creating this atmosphere where fake news is so salient, because really fake news has existed for a very long time, propaganda has existed for a very long time, so why are we seeing such a resurgence of this issue right now? So there's a couple things that I want to call out for why I think this is happening. The first would be socio-political fragmentation in our society right now. This idea that we have a lack of shared reality and that much of our beliefs are driven by ideology. The second piece is really about the information landscape and the dramatic changes that we've really been seeing in recent years with how information is created and disseminated. So this is the idea that we live in a search engine society or a social media society, and that we have a world that is much more mediated or driven by machines and algorithms. So I'm going to unpack those a little bit further. With socio-political fragmentation, there are three pieces of it that I want to discuss. The first would be that ideology is part of what's driving this fragmentation. So Karl Marx called ideology as ideas serving as weapons for social interests. And I think that this means that people are using ideology as a way of protecting their social positions, that people have a very strong allegiance to their social and political identities. We hear a lot about identity-driven politics. And this, I think, can lead to dogmatic beliefs, which are the seeds of truthiness, which is a term that Stephen Colbert popularized about a decade ago now, which is that idea of opinions as being truth. And that kind of leads us to another popular term, new terminology out there. Post-truth was actually the Oxford English Dictionary 2016 word of the year. And so the post-truth era that we're living in is characterized by extreme skepticism. So I think people are holding their own beliefs really close to them, and this is actually resulting in sort of a fear-based approach to the world around us, which is reinforcing our ideological viewpoints. I think we have an overemphasis right now in our society on the postmodern interpretation of truth, the idea of relativism, or it's all relative. And in my experience, I work with students mostly in upper-level undergraduate at the university. My experience in working with them is that they're actually already quite skeptical And so the issue isn't that we need to increase skepticism in our students when we're looking at sources, but that we actually need to teach them how to trust. The third piece relates to the information landscape, which is personalized information. That's the idea that we're living in an echo chambers, or we all have our own filter bubbles. That's what I'm getting at with the idea of personalized information. And so the information that we're seeing is really reinforcing our cognitive biases. And we're really in a position where we can let our biases sort of determine the information that we're going to come across. And so that's somewhat problematic. I think that fake news feeds on all of this, and it makes us really susceptible and more open to information and psychological warfare, which is in fact occurring or has occurred during the past election season in particular. So supporting these shifts is our changes in the information landscape, which is shifting along as well, and that idea of the search engine society and the social media society. The changes in how we access information and the types of information that is available to us. So this slide is something of a simplification. I don't mean to be anti-technology in this slide or say that, you know, one is good and one is bad. This is sort of a simplification to get at some of these ideas. Both human-mediated and machine-mediated access to information has its own sort of problematic issues. But I want to be critical about the current way that we're accessing information through the machine-mediated aspect. So I'm actually going to start at the bottom of the list here with knowing is easy. And so there's this idea that you can just Google it, that knowing is something that we should be able to do easily. It's not something that you have to work for anymore. And so I think that when there aren't easy answers, when maybe Google search doesn't give you a snippet right away that answers your question, and there aren't easy answers to a lot of issues that are occurring right now, this actually creates tension or angst or existential crisis in ourselves because we think we should be able to know things easily and we can't always. And back up to the top of the list here, this idea of public versus private, I think is also another big tension. So the way that our access to information happens, it's actually exploited for profit by the capitalist attention economy, where you are the product of the search engine. And this leads to things like search engine optimization, social media bots, different strategies to sort of game the algorithms and get your attention that advertisers and propagandists can use. And so I think it's important that we remember that Google is in the advertising business, and they have a private aim as opposed to a public aim in thinking about how people access information. So this just means that there are different motivations and goals behind the tools that we're using. So when we think about what this means for how we teach about information literacy as librarians, I think that it's really obvious that fake news is about evaluating sources, and there's been a lot of discussion about that. But we also need to talk about evaluating the search as well, questioning the search engines, and really incorporating critical information literacy, critical literacy into our instruction. So that's the idea of putting information sources and search tools into context, which is what I was just doing. That is the part where we're talking about the systems at the macro level, the social, political, economic systems affecting how we access information and the source types that are out there. And then also looking at the micro level, what are our personal or cognitive biases that are affecting how we access information. So how do we actually put this into practice? How do we move students from Google to quality sources? So I'm sorry, but when I do a Google search on a topic, CQ Researcher is not in my top page of Google results, right? So we know that we need to help students get from that first page of Google to good sources and then help them evaluate sources. So how do we do that? I'm going to turn this over to Tom to talk about some of the evaluation of sources and what we should be looking for.
Hello. I'm Tom, and I am the editor of CQ researcher and Sage business researcher, and we are primarily journalistic products that are tailored to student use. Our products, our publications are designed to help guide students to a deeper understanding of complex, controversial topics and walk them through so that by the time they're done reading our reports, they have a clear and deep understanding and a balanced and accurate view of those topics. So we approach these issues and topics from a journalistic standpoint, but we also have a framework to the reports that is somewhat academic in the sense that we footnote our reports, footnote the information so that students know where it has come from, and we fact check our reports professionally to make sure that what we're putting in front of students is accurate. So I want to talk just a little bit about how we approach information and approach topics from that vantage point, from a journalistic vantage point, but with student use in mind. I don't think I need to tell you that there is huge mistrust out there right now in the country of our primary institutions. The media, business, government is in many measurements at an all-time low. The Edelman Communications Company does a barometer of trust in institutions every year, and they found that it is at a historic low, not just in the United States, but in 17 countries that they looked at. And among those institutions is the media. And just rolling off a point that Hailey made, the comment that they make is the cycle of distrust is magnified by the emergence of a media echo chamber that reinforces personal beliefs while shutting out opposing viewpoints. Among college students, the mistrust of the media is very high. Some figures from Gallup that were done in just past December, the majority of college students, 59% of them, have little or no trust in the press to report the news accurately. And only half of college students say that they would look to the major media for information on controversial or important topics. Where would they go? 26% would go to their social media sources, and 1 in 5 would go to some of the new digital media such as Huffington Post or BuzzFeed. So with that as the backdrop, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we at CQ Researcher approach information, what some of the questions we ask when we're evaluating that information as we put our own reports together. Solid journalism has many attributes to it. I wouldn't pretend to go through all of them, but I've picked out some of the main ones that we in our own minds use as somewhat of a checklist when we're evaluating information. One is the sourcing. How credible is it? Is it authoritative? Is it trustworthy? If people are being quoted who have no real credibility on a subject, or if they are on the surface biased about what they're talking about, we're very skeptical to use that information in our reports. Balance is another issue. As we approach other reports, we look at whether it's balanced, and balance has many qualities to it, but one of the sins I think that the media have committed over the past couple of years is the sin of false equivalency, where if they are analyzing two candidates, for example, they might feel compelled to make their reporting balanced So they will say, well, this guy did something that's really bad, but she did something that's bad, so they're all bad, so it's all balanced. And I think that there have been some mistakes that even the major media have made in drawing false equivalency when A does not really equal B. So we look at that carefully to be sure things are in balance. Facts are important, obviously, and we look at whether facts are being spun, whether things are exaggerated, whether they're based on innuendo or rumor, guesswork or bias, taking a critical view of information in reports and studies and articles that we use as the basis of our own reporting. Fairness is important. There's a line that says there should be no surprises. If you're reading a report or a story in a newspaper and somebody is referred to in a derogatory way, they should have been given the opportunity to comment, to tell their side of the story. And when we put our reports together, we're very careful to make sure that we gather the other side and give them an opportunity to comment. For students, depth and context and nuance and enough information to inform their critical thinking is really important, and we go to great lengths to make sure that our reports offer that kind of information. And finally, in evaluating information, we want to see healthy skepticism, but we don't want to see a cynical view of issues. I think when there is cynicism in reporting, it automatically leads people to look for other kinds of sources of information, and this is what's driving people in a lot of cases to fake news. Because if they feel like what they're reading is imbued with cynicism, they're not going to believe it, and they're going to say, I'm going to go find information somewhere else, and they automatically fall into sources that are not credible. So we kind of look at information through this lens and evaluate it before we go to the next step and do our own reporting and our own information gathering to create our reports. A couple quotes, that I put in here just because I think they're important. Bob Woodward, who's famous for the Watergate reporting, said recently, journalists should not have a dog in the political fight except to find that best obtainable version of the truth. Unfortunately, finding the truth is becoming difficult. The other quote I have here is from Kellyanne Conway, who's an advisor to President Trump, and her quote was, our press secretary gave alternative facts. We are in a world of alternative facts. We are in a post-truth world, and it's really hard for students and consumers of news to figure out what's true and what isn't. When Pew did a study recently, 2/3 of Americans said that fake news has left them very confused about basic facts. How do you evaluate the truth? How do you arrive at the truth? Most people in this country now are unsure of that. For journalists themselves, including us, and certainly for journalists who are out working in the atmosphere that we have today, there are a number of challenges facing them. One is just basic mistrust of the media. A lot of officials don't want to talk to reporters now. A lot of regular people don't want to be interviewed by the media because there is an atmosphere of mistrust. Our own president has called the mainstream media, the New York Times, CNN, the major networks, quote, the enemy of the American people. And this has filtered throughout society, and there's a great deal of mistrust of reporters and editors now. There's a huge misunderstanding of the role of the press in a democratic society. A recent survey found that only 11% of American adults know that the First Amendment guarantees freedom of the press. Only 1 out of 10 people even knows that. So they don't understand the role that the media play in guaranteeing a healthy democracy. There are huge financial pressures on the media these days, and that has led to huge layoffs of reporters and editors. There are fewer journalists to cover the news, and we have seen this especially in coverage of state house news. State houses, state governments is where a lot of policy is created that percolates up to the national level, and a lot of states are not being covered by journalists at all. Stuff's getting done, laws are being passed, and nobody's watching because there have been so many layoffs. Eroding attention spans, librarians know this, students and other people are distracted through social media, they're not paying attention, hard to get their attention. And then the press has created some self-inflicted wounds that have helped to create this atmosphere of mistrust. Just last week, the Wall Street Journal fired its primary international affairs reporter for some unethical behavior. And there have been a number of other instances where the press itself has created mistakes that have helped to foster this atmosphere of mistrust. There's partisan there are partisan differences in the way the public views the press. Democrats are more likely than Republicans to say that the national news media do a good job of covering the news and keeping people informed. Republicans tend to be more skeptical than Democrats, but both are skeptical. This graphic just shows the decline in the number of reporters and editors who are out there working to gather news. Newspapers are under tremendous financial strain, and they've had to lay a lot of people off, so that just is a graphic illustration of it. So where has this all led us? This quote is from the CEO of the Newseum in Washington. He says his biggest fear is delegitimization of journalists. His big worry is that we as a society are no longer going to be able to agree on even the facts because we don't trust anyone who's reporting them. That's a pretty serious concern that he's voicing, and a concern, I think, for our democracy. So finally, just a few words about how we at CQ Researcher and Business Researcher try to do our own work to try to fight back against this tidal wave of skepticism and delegitimization of the news media. We approach issues with the desire to bring depth to our reporting. We search out multiple perspectives and views on controversial topics. Instead of closing off different points of view, we seek them out. We have a section in our reports that's called At Issue or Pro-Con, and we actually try to find people who disagree with each other and debate each other on the issues so that we can give students a healthy dialogue about the important issues that we're covering. When we approach the sourcing, who we're talking to, who we're interviewing, or who we're quoting in our reports, we try to make sure that they really know what they're talking about, that they are experts, that they're professors who study the issues that we're writing on, that they're people in government whose job it is to focus on these issues, and we really try to filter out the people who don't have anything to say or who don't know what they're talking about. We try to offer students who are reading our reports the proper historical and situational framing. We have a section in our reports that provides the historical background on the issues that we cover so that they know how we got to today based on what's happened in the past. We have a very clear format for our reports that walks students through a logical progression to understanding a complex issue. so that when they're doing their research, oftentimes they're doing a paper or an assignment, and they're approaching a complex topic, whether it's something in government or something in science, something in education, and they don't know much about it, they're intimidated by it. Our format for our reports will take them on a very clear step through that topic and guide them to a deeper understanding of it. We have a lot of different entry points into the topic. We have a chronology, various bibliographies, issue questions, a pro-con debate, and other features that help walk them through. And then finally, we give them sources for further study so that once they've read our reports and they want to go deeper, we give them links to other stories, we give them books and reports and studies that they can follow through and keep going with their research.
I've seen some skepticism lately about anonymous sources.
Yep.
And I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Anonymous sources, my own view is they are important, but they are often overused and abused for various reasons. There are some purists who say journalists should never use what we call blind sources or anonymous sources. Every time you quote somebody, they ought to have their name there. I think in the real world, we would never find things out about what's happening in government without it. But I can tell you that as a reader of the New York Times and Washington Post and other publications, I am frequently frustrated because I think there are a lot of times when they offer anonymity when they should not. A lot of politicians use this for trial balloons to get an idea out there or to cast aspersions on somebody or something, and they make this devil's bargain with the journalists who, if you don't give me anonymity, I'll never talk to you again. And I don't think journalists are pushing back hard enough on those cases. So I think it's a mixed bag. It's a very good question, though. And I think the reading public is skeptical because of the overuse of anonymity. And it's something journalists should pay attention to. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think you did it very well.
Any other questions, thoughts? Yes, sir. Yeah. That's in the United States.
Is that journalist as traditionally defined, and they work for a major
Yeah.
established media outlet, or is it in fact journalists across all of the new media that are rising as well?
That
Do they
particular
fill in-
chart is just newspapers. Now, not just big newspapers across the country. There has been a fair amount of hiring of journalists, but I'll get to that question, in the new media. But what's happening, they are hiring, not always, but in many cases they're hiring multimedia journalists whose job it is to create new kinds of content. Some of that content is very good. Some of it is what's called clickbait, to drive usage to those websites, and they're mainly commercial enterprises. So there is hiring going on in journalism, but it's a very different kind of hiring than traditional shoe leather reporting and covering of government and policy issues. So there's a real concern that traditional reporting has been decimated and that important news is just not getting covered. And even reporters who work for regular newspapers now are being pressured to do a lot of other things other than reporting and writing stories. When they go out on an assignment, a lot of times they have to create video. They are their job reviews are based on how many clicks their stories are getting. And so you can imagine the kinds of stories that are not going to get covered because they may not generate a ton of clicks, but they're really important, and the kind of stuff that is getting covered, which may be trivial. And so that's another issue going on.